Okay, I am Dr. Beverly Bond. I'm a professor in the history department at University of Memphis. My major focus of writing and research is 19th century African American history, specifically African American women and Memphis history. I teach courses in Black Memphis, in African American women, or history of African American women, and then a lot of graduate historiography and upper division courses, and the specialized course in 19th century Memphis, or 19th century African American history. So most of what I will say about the Memphis school systems, segregation, desegregation, teachers, it's going to focus or center on 19th century to give some background or some context for what you see in the 20th century.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. Can we start off with just kind of sharing what you know about the establishment of the first Black schools here in Memphis?
Okay, let me just kind of back up a little, because I know that people know about the early history of Memphis, but just to kind of give some, as I say in my graduate classes, to give you a landscape to put this information on. And I think most people know from the bicentennial celebration several years ago that Memphis was established, laid out everything about 1819. That doesn't mean that that's the first involvement or settlement of people at the site of Memphis, because Memphis had been a location or a place where many different colonial settlements had existed. So you could say that Memphis operates under several different flags even before you have the establishment of the city. It had been explored by the Spanish, it had been explored by the French. It was the essentially hunting grounds and settlements, some settlements for the Chickasaw Indians. So it's it's always had people at what's called the Fourth Bluff. That's where you have the earliest settlements of the city, at the Fourth Bluff. And if you're trying to figure out, or for people who don't really know where the Fourth Bluff is, you know that the most important thing geographically about Memphis, the early Memphis settlements, are that it sits on high above the Mississippi River. And what makes it an ideal settlement is that at the Fourth Bluff, you're not as likely to get flooding of the Mississippi River. If you go down a little further north of that bluff to where the Wolf River empties into the Mississippi, that's where you're going to get some flooding. But the question of, why settle why was Memphis located where it was because of the bluff. The Fourth Bluff is roughly today where you would have maybe the Church of the River. And that's, of course, a beautiful church that if you're in the windows, the picture windows, you can look out over the Mississippi, where the Ornamental Metal Museum is located. Years ago, I used to be able to say where Spaghetti Warehouse restaurant would be. And that's an important location. If you go a little further to the north, down from the bluffs, I could say today where you would see, where you find the University of Memphis Law School. That's a little further to the north of those Fourth Bluffs. Go a little further to the south, you're going to be heading into South Memphis, a little bit further into Mississippi. So you can kind of get a feel for what's here. It was an important transport or a location where you had a lot of different groups of people interacting. It's a transportation hub, if you want to put it that way, in the sense of the modern term that we use for the FedEx system. That's what you might have seen back in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. That's why it was so important. The river transport is essential. So why there? Okay, that's where it would be. And everything in terms of the settlement of Memphis from the early 1800s, from 1819, moves to the east from that point, and to the south, and even somewhat to the north. So you start with that little settlement on the river, and then you just kind of expand. One of the key factors in expansion or growth of Memphis from even the mid-1800s has been annexation and expansion. And of course, one of the first annexations, you don't necessarily just have one settlement located at that fourth bluff or in that region. You have Memphis, and then you have what was called South Memphis. And these were two separate community settlements. And in 1850, South Memphis, which I think essentially is from what we call Union Avenue now, and then going to the south, South Memphis annexed South Memphis. So it becomes this slightly larger city, and then it just keeps expanding, expanding to the north, expanding to the east. That's the growth pattern. Okay, so that's where you kind of, the landscape as it existed. In terms of race relations, I think is very important. Some people may be familiar with the book that Dr. Jan Sherman and I published several years ago called Memphis in Black and White. And what we tried to do in that book was to essentially create tell a history of Memphis that recognizes that Memphis has always been a city in black and white, that this didn't just happen in the early 1900s. It didn't just happen in the 1960s. That you can, in some way, it's always been that city in black and white. There have always been African American people, as well as Native American people, as well as people of many different ethnic backgrounds in the city from the very beginning, whether you're talking about Irish, maybe some Italians, getting into the late 19th century Germans, not even, from the mid-19th century, German population. So you've had all of these different mixtures of people in the city. In terms of economically, what was important, Memphis is not, you're not going to find, or you didn't find in 19th century Memphis plantations as such, because it's a transportation hub, which means that it will depend on the plantation or the farming economies in the rural areas surrounding it, and in particular on cotton. And if you want to think in terms of what is that dependence going to look like, in the surrounding areas where you have large cotton crops being produced, cotton planters will have to get their crops, first they'll have to harvest, then gin, then bundle it up, bale it up, and then get it into the city to bring it down to the wharves and then to transport it from with using the riverboats. The access to the river is very important. Transport it south down to New Orleans, and then out from the port of New Orleans around to the East Coast, and then either up to the New England textile mills, or either across the ocean to the textile mills in Britain and France or whatever. So that's an important part of the economy, just the transport of the cotton. But in order to support that cotton production and to support the labor system, which of course, cotton production, plantations, this is the South before the Civil War, the labor system was enslaved labor. So Memphis as a marketing place, you have to kind of envision that whatever is needed to facilitate that agricultural system, Memphis will be very much a part of. So Memphis is probably, was definitely the largest inland cotton marketplace. North of New Orleans, the largest slave selling or slave, I don't want to say slave producing, but slave marketing area. So you're going to have a slave trading facilities down in centralized Memphis, downtown. You're also going to have places where cotton can be transported, can be marketed, can be sold. So it's a very productive area in terms of the marketing itself. There's some wonderful illustrations of early Memphis, Front Street in early Memphis, where you can see all of this, how this marketing is taking place. You see the dray wagons where cotton could be loaded on these. Black laborers would drive the wagons down to the wharf, then from the wharf they would get it on the boats and then ship it out. In terms of kind of shifting over to the educational system, the educational side of it, and if you don't mind, I'll just kind of look at my notes. In 1826, Memphis was incorporated, and as a result of the incorporated, a different system of government, a new system of government was organized. Marcus Winchester, who was the son of one of the early founders of Memphis, became the first mayor. There were some references to the existence of private schools in the city, but there was very little evidence that these schools existed in the town. They just kind of mentioned them in the writings of some people. And probably the most prominent of these early schools and schoolmasters that developed in this period was the school that was operated by a man called Eugene McGivney, and it was a school for boys. The 1826 city charter provided for public schools, and we have to kind of realize that that was a period nationally where the idea of development of public schools, common schools, was happening. And along with this development of public schools, common schools, came the idea, well, if we're going to develop these schools, then we have to make them more accessible to more people through funding, through taxation of the citizens. We have to figure out when we're laying out townships, maybe reserving one section of the township for the support or for the location of schools, of a public school system. And the idea there was that in order for the average citizen, the average person, the common man, and remember Andrew Jackson, Rise of the Common Man, in order for that to happen, education was going to be important. So this idea of reserving one section of a township as they're being laid out, it was not new. It went all the way back to the 1870s when federal land was being sold, townships were being laid out, the ordinances, the Northwest Ordinance, the Land Ordinance, all of these, in the layout of these towns, you had the provision for that one section that would be dedicated, section 16, I think they called it, would be dedicated for education. So there is that way in which when the charter, when the town is chartered, you can have that section reserved. Now, who's going to be able to attend this school? Memphis was a city in black and white. That did not necessarily mean that there was a promotion or that there was an encouragement for black education, even though in Tennessee, and this may kind of challenge what a lot of people think about the antebellum South or the antebellum nation. Most people tend to think that state legislatures prohibited black education. That is not necessarily true. Some state legislatures did. They had laws, statutes that said black people, slave and free, cannot be educated. On the other hand, other state legislatures and Tennessee, other state legislatures, and Tennessee is a good example of this, they would leave it to the local ordinances to take care of that. So you're not necessarily going to find something in Tennessee that says the state prohibits the education of people of African descent. But you will find in some local ordinances a provision that says we do not encourage the education of African Americans or people of African descent. But that didn't mean that Black people were not educated, because there were all of these other ways or reasons that an American person, a person of African descent in this area of West Tennessee, across the state, all these other ways that they could be educated. And some were educated in what were called Sabbath schools. And these were schools that operated out of churches that taught reading to enslaved people. Now, why would they do this? They're religious reasons. The idea that people should be able to read the Bible. So you teach people how to read. There were some planters who educated some of their enslaved people, especially if you were a planter and you had one of your children happened to be a child by an enslaved woman, a child that you'd had by an enslaved woman, then you might decide, well, I'm going to provide that child with some education. And they will, of course, still be enslaved, but they'll also be able to help with some of the production and marketing of whatever crops that I need to have done. They keep the books for me or something like that. So you could find that there were some Black children educated in that way. Black children of well-to-do planters. So you've got Sabbath schools, you've got the private education. You might also have, and you did have some free Black people in Memphis. They might teach their children, and in teaching or in operating or setting up a way to teach their children, they would also be able to maybe bring in a few other freed Black children outside of their households, and maybe a few enslaved children. But that's always going to be tricky, because whether an enslaved child is educated or not really depends on the child's owner. Okay, so it's what I want to just say is that what I want to show essentially is that there were some ways in which African Americans in Memphis might be educated, not necessarily through some creation or through the development of common schools through tax support. But you have the possibility of tax-supported common schools. You have other ways that Blacks could be educated. One of the unique things, I think, in Memphis, one of the things that I discovered when I was doing my research, Memphis did have a small free Black population. And many of these free Black people were property holders. So it becomes a question of, okay, if property holders are going to be taxed to support a common school system, and I'm a property holder, and I'm expected to pay the tax, will that mean that my children can attend the school? Sounds logical, very logical, to the point that the city ordinances would say, well, tell you what, if by mistake you are charged the school tax and you're a free Black person, we will refund it to you, because we don't want that happening. When, education may happen, but it's not going to be through free Black children attending these common schools that are the public schools that are developing. Okay. I want to just also mention that there was one other early possibility for education of Black children in Memphis, and that was through kind of like an experiment in a utopian society. And I think many people are familiar with the utopian community called the Neshoba, which was created by Francis Wright, who was a Scottish reformer, and it was in Shelby County, and what we now know, what is now Germantown. It was a very large plantation, about 2,000 acres, located near the Wolf River. That's why we can kind of pinpoint Germantown all the way over to where the Wolf River crosses Germantown Road, or just imagine 2,000 acres in that area. And when Frances Wright established this community, her idea was that this would be a model for the possibility of gradual emancipation in the South. Now, if we go back to this whole idea of gradual emancipation was something that happened, something we could see happening in many northern states in the Revolutionary War era. In the New England and the middle colonies, as the revolution is kind of taking place, there was this question of, we're not a plantation economy, so can we think in terms of ending slavery? And that happens in what become the northern states between about 1777 all the way to 1804. You have the immediate or gradual elimination of slavery. In most places, it was a gradual process. It only is immediate in two states, what will become two states, and that's in Massachusetts, and I think the other one is either New Hampshire or Vermont. Your teachers can look that up.
Yeah.
But those are the only two places that it's immediate. And immediate in terms of Massachusetts, for example, would be the inclusion in one of their early constitutions in this period of Revolutionary War. The inclusion of a clause or a statement that says all men and women are born free and equal. Okay, so if everybody is born free and equal, then some enslaved people began to say, okay, well, doesn't that mean me? And the response in that colony was, yeah, I guess it does. So you have the immediate end of slavery. I'm simplifying this. But the general process was that you had a gradual emancipation in which enslaved people were to receive their freedom on a particular birthday. Let's say, for example, in the colony, in the state of New Jersey. And New Jersey had the distinction of being the last of these northern states to include these gradual emancipation orders. I think it's New York and then New Jersey, but New Jersey is the last. So in 1804, they include in their state constitution a provision for the emancipation of enslaved people in that state, and saying that all enslaved people who are born after January 1st of 1804 will receive their freedom or will be emancipated. For women, it might be the 26th birthday. For men, it might be the 28th. And those birthdays can vary from state to state. What that meant, very simply, was that slavery did not end in that state in 1804, because you would have enslaved people in some of these northern states, in some places up to almost the eve of the Civil War. So the idea that there's no slavery in the North and there is slavery in the South, people really need to think about how that works out when you have this process of gradual emancipation. Some states included, with this idea of gradual emancipation, the idea that from the time that the enslaved child was born until they reached that birthday, there would be a way in which there would be almost like an obligation on the part of the slaveholder to educate the enslaved child or the person. So you're preparing them for this life of freedom. Sounds good. But the other side of this is that you still have free labor for 28 years. You can reap the benefits of the labor of this man or woman for 28, 26, however many years. You, in some cases, would have to, that could go even further, because if this is an enslaved woman and she is still enslaved and she has children, you've got to kind of work that out as well. Could you ship or transport these enslaved men, women, and children to other property as you would decide to move maybe south? If you're an enslaved, I think New York passes one of these laws in 1799, the late 1790s. And what you see happening in terms of some slaveholders in New York, New Jersey, wherever, is that they don't they're not interested in losing all this very valuable part of their estates. So they simply move from New York, New Jersey, Kentucky, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and they take these children, and these adults in some cases, with them. So you've got this question, what's the status of these people? And some states or some communities would include with these ideas of gradual emancipation, the idea of compensation to make it worth the while of the owner to go ahead and emancipate the person. So Francis Wright, as a reformer in the 1820s, sets up a utopian community in which she wants to create a model of gradual compensated emancipation, something that would kind of serve as an example for planters in the region, where they could say, okay, maybe it won't be so bad if I, emancipate my slaves, if I do it in this gradual process. So what she does is she purchases, or she is granted title to, or whatever, some enslaved people who then come to the Neshoba plantation, and they work on the Neshoba plantation until the value of their labor or the work that they do is enough to purchase or compensate for their freedom. Neshoba is established about 1825, so it's pretty early. It was a farm, it was a plantation. So here you have enslaved labor that is working on this plantation, but with the idea that they may get free at some point. She also supported this idea of educating people for freedom, preparing them for freedom, teaching them some skills, but also maybe operating a school. So she set up a school on the Neshoba plantation, and there was a free Black woman, Josephine Lelote, who was hired as the teacher for the enslaved people on the plantation. And very often, I think this is a model that you see in terms of the education and the value that African Americans place on education. It's not just the children who are going to be enslaved. It's men, women, and children. So these are the people who could possibly attend that school. And that is probably, I would say most likely, the first example of an organized educational facility that would be available to a very specific group of Black people in Shelby County.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. That's really important. As I think about the establishment of first Black schools here in Memphis, I often think, first Black public schools, but I appreciate you taking time to think about all the different ways that the Black community has engaged in educational practices with this on their own, and with the support of abolitionists and people interested in freedom and what that looks like. So,
now, I should also say Neshoba doesn't last that long. It lasts only till about 1828, 29, and it fails as an experiment. It's an experiment in creating the idea of a perfect society with this goal of moving toward emancipation. Francis Wright went back to Scotland to try to raise some more money. While she's gone, there's a lot of conflict and dissension that's taking place. The whole idea of Neshoba, of a community like Neshoba existing, kind of an interracial community existing in Memphis and Shelby County, it really points to the fact that race relations in this community, this developing community, were a lot more fluid or flexible. However, by the end of the 1820s, these race relations are tightening. And this is happening because of, by the early 1830s, changes in the Tennessee Constitution that tighten up on
revolts.
Revolts that are taking place, the Nat Turner Rebellion, even the suggestion that there was a slave revolt, the rumor of a slave revolt when it hadn't even happened, that tended to make people very fearful.
Yeah.
So as things are changing, as this fluidity in race relations begin to tighten up, there is less of a feeling. Let me back up. There's more suspicion of communities like Neshoba existing. So she's having money problems. There are changes in the society as a whole. There were a lot of utopian communities, not a lot, but there were utopian communities in other parts of the country. And some of them advocated things like less rigid marital relationships, or what people call free love.
Yeah.
And so you had these rumors that free love was taking place out at Neshoba. And, with the money problems and everything, when Frances Wright came back to Neshoba, she decided that it might be better to kind of shut down that experiment. Yeah. So she takes the enslaved people who are there, she has them transported to Haiti and emancipated in Haiti. And, I won't go into the whole history of Haiti, but, that's Haiti at that point, by the 1820s and early 1830s, it is, it's free.
Yeah.
It's had its Haitian Revolution. It's overthrown the French and French slavery. So it's changing. It has all kind of possibilities that don't materialize. But
So with that said, just kind of thinking through Neshoba, the Sabbath schools, also different ways that the Black community is educating itself. What does this look like at the turn of the Civil War?
Well, by the time you get to the Civil War, if we look at Memphis in the 1850s, you're already getting local statutes that are prohibiting or trying to shut down or close down Sabbath schools. You're already getting, you're seeing in newspapers, people who are writing letters that are saying, okay, there may be some planters who think that just educating one or two Black people, that might be okay. But it sets a bad model. It's a possibility we don't want to have.
Yeah.
So, you don't have, number one, they don't have access to the common schools, the public schools. Then you've got the few places like Neshoba that might have existed, they've shut down. You do still have some private education that's taking place. And I think we also have to just kind of think in terms of, what do we mean by education? Is it just book learning?
Yeah.
Because education can also mean training and skills.
Yeah.
And I think, a lot of people would say, well, that's kind of like maybe industrial education that comes on a little later. There's always been skills training. And there were certain occupations for which African American youth were being trained by other free Black people. I think one good example of this is something like barbering.
Yeah.
So you had this core of free Black barbers or enslaved barbers who were now training young Black men to be barbers. And that was seen as a way in which a free Black person, free Black man, or an enslaved Black man could uplift himself, because Black people across the South, just across the South, they, until probably the post-Civil War, late 1800s, Black men had a monopoly on barbering. They were the ones who, if you went into a hotel in the South and you were going to get your hair cut, you would more than likely have a free Black man as your barber.
Yeah.
On the riverboats, free Black barbers. So that's a trade that they're being trained for. They might be trained for maybe making barrels to put liquor or whatever in. They might be trained as carpenters. So that's a level of skills education that's taking place, and it's taking place in it's not taking place in a specific school context.
Mm-hmm.
It's taking place as kind of like an indentured context.
Mm-hmm.
Free black women or enslaved women were educated as seamstresses
Mm-hmm.
or as cooks or as hairdressers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's skill education that's taking place. So that's one thing. But, and then you've got free black people who are still educating their children
mm-hmm.
and other children in the community. But you don't have schools.
Mm-hmm.
And when do you begin to see the wholesale development of school education,
mm-hmm.
book learning education? That's going to be one of the contributions as such that we see coming out of the Civil War period.
Mm-hmm.
And just as a kind of putting the landscape out there again, 1860, you have the election of Abraham Lincoln. 1860 into 1861, you have the secession
mm-hmm.
of the southern states, slaveholding states.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of them, but all the slaveholding states except 4.
Mm-hmm.
Tennessee is slaveholding. It is an upper South border state in a sense, but that
mm-hmm.
does secede. And depending on whether you're in, you could say it's the last southern state to secede, although I think some people say it's Virginia or North Carolina that's really the last. We always said it was the last. But in June of 1861, Tennessee secedes and joins the Confederacy.
Mm-hmm.
June of 1862, Memphis falls to the Union naval forces on the Mississippi River.
Mm-hmm.
And technically, that is the end of full secession into the Confederacy, participation in the Confederacy.
Mm-hmm.
And what you have happening is that because it is this riverboat place and on a key site along the Mississippi River, and you've got a part of the Union strategy during the Civil War was to divide the Confederacy.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mississippi River is part of that dividing line. So you divide the Western Confederacy of Arkansas and parts of Louisiana from the eastern part, mm-hmm. Tennessee, all the way over to Virginia. And to do that, you have to take control of the Mississippi. Mm-hmm. So you have Union forces moving up the river from New Orleans, taking different ports mm-hmm. along the Mississippi till they get to Memphis and down the river as well, mm-hmm. getting to Memphis. So when Memphis falls, this is an important victory for mm-hmm. the Union. And they move in and establish very quickly a military presence at what's called Fort Pickering, mm-hmm. the construction of Fort Pickering, which becomes a major Union installation. What is also happening, especially after you get the fall of Memphis and the creation of Fort Pickering, you begin to see large numbers of enslaved people who leave the farms and plantations in western Tennessee and eastern Arkansas, northern Mississippi, and they kind of flood into Memphis. They mm-hmm. congregate in Memphis. The Union has no plan for how they're going to deal with this anywhere mm-hmm. across the South during the Civil War. So what begins to develop are in terms of this movement and dealing with race relations in this wartime situation. Most people understand that emancipation was not an initial goal of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Lincoln did not go into the Civil War thinking, I'm going to free all the slaves. Mm-hmm. It becomes a goal, but it becomes that as a wartime measure to try to figure out how are you going to defeat the Confederacy and restore the Union. So it's kind of like planning, all right? Mm-hmm. If the Southern economy is built on the existence of slave labor, then if I can figure out how to undermine that economy mm-hmm. by freeing the slaves, then I'll do it because that's a way of restoring the Union. I can mm-hmm. kind of force Southern planters to push to get back into the Union and end their fighting. That's the key thing, end the fighting. So Lincoln, says, okay, but I've got to do this in a kind of gradual process. So you go through 2 confiscation acts, which meant essentially the first one, all enslaved people who find their way behind Union Army lines, we might let them stay.
Yeah.
We're going to, somebody else's property, but we'll let them stay. So we're going to confiscate that property, and we're going to use it to help build forts, fortifications, like Fort Pickering. Then you have some Union generals who are saying, well, let's take this a step further. Maybe some generals with kind of a little bit of a background in the anti-slavery movement or whatever. They might say, well, all of these people who find their way behind to Union Army lines, we're going to use them and we're going to free them.
Yeah.
They will no longer be obligated to their owners. We're not going to send them back, because a part of that first confiscation act was the idea that they're going to get here, we're going to use them to their labor, and then when the Civil War, when the fighting ends, when these Confederates stop fighting us and the war stops, then we will return this property to their owners. It's still the idea that enslaved people are property to be returned. And, our Constitution, from the very beginning, recognized property as being sacred.
Yeah.
So you can't take a person's property and keep it. You might hold it, but then the idea is you're going to give it back. Well, the second confiscation act says, well, no, this is to encourage more enslaved people to leave these plantations and to put a bigger price on ending this civil conflict. Those people who come behind Union Army lines, we're going to free them. They're not your property anymore. Then you see gradual processes of emancipation taking place. We're going to free or end slavery in the Western territories, which, of course, the government had the power to do because those Western territories belong to the United States government. So we're going to end slavery there. We're going to end slavery in the District of Columbia. They could do that because it's not a state, it's federal. So end it there. So you see this gradual building up. And then Lincoln says, okay, I'm going to maybe suggest that we'll put a carrot out there. If you end your rebellion by January 1st, then let me back up. If you do not end your rebellion by January 1st of 1863, then we will just emancipate slaves in all areas still in rebellion against the United States. So again, it's an offer, it's a possibility of what will happen. Now, what had happened in places like Memphis, when the Union Army moved in, under these confiscation acts, they realized they had to do something with the enslaved people. So you begin to see the establishment of what becomes known as contraband camps. It's kind of a tricky word to use, and I'll use it at this point because that is what they were called. Others would say, well, no, these are refugee camps, but refugeeing becomes a different kind of term during the Civil War, and it's usually applied to Southern planters who are literally packing up their whole plantations and moving across the river into more Confederate-held territory. Western Arkansas, East Texas, just kind of moving the whole. So you are refugeeing your property, your enslaved people, everything's, and essentially you are becoming a refugee. So one of the interesting things is that when the federal government begins to set up some kind of provisions to care for people during the Civil War, they established what's called the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands, or the Freedmen's Bureau. So everybody identifies it as something for the freedmen, for freed people
Mm-hmm.
that's set up during the Civil War, something that will offer education.
Mm-hmm.
People don't usually identify the other parts of it, that bureau also has a responsibility for refugees who are essentially those white Southerners who have moved into other parts of the South, maybe even further south in Mississippi. They are refugees. Okay. And abandoned lands, all of this land that has been left by these people as the Union Army is moving in, as these people, the planters, refugee further west or south. All of that comes under this bureau, which is going to be very important. So when they set up this camp, or when they move into Memphis, the Memphis area, just like they did in other parts of the South, they create these camps for those African Americans who have just fled the farms and plantations in what can only be described in many ways as acts of self-emancipation. Because, African American enslaved people knew that this is a brother's war, but this is our only best opportunity to gain our freedom. So we're going to do what African Americans have done over the course of 400 years or 300 years of slavery, and we're going to run. So they run to the cities, to Union fortifications, and that's what Memphis becomes. Becomes kind of like what we see, the term that we have seen in other places called a sanctuary city. It wasn't always that way, but it people kind of saw it that way, because once you get behind Union Army lines, especially after the Second Confiscation Act and then the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, you kind of think, okay, I'm safe. And then with the Emancipation Proclamation, because you're here. And one of the parts of the Emancipation Proclamation that most people don't understand was that little clause that said, all of the men who are in these camps who are able to serve, who are healthy and able to serve, we will welcome you into the Union Army in segregated units, but we'll welcome you into the Union Army. So they are drafting Black men out of these camps to serve officially in the Union Army. They had been serving in kind of some contraband units in other parts of the South, but now we're saying we're going to bring you in and we're going to create African American units under white officers for the most part, except very late in the war. But we're going to welcome you, and you will now be officially the United States Colored Troops, and we'll welcome you into the Navy to kind of help garrison some of these boats, and you can garrison forts in some cases. Took a while for the Army to work out this whole thing of training and weapons and all of this, but there are a lot of psychological things that are going on in first encouraging these freed people, the enslaved people, to leave their farms or to leave the plantations, come flee this and undermine the economic system in the South is pretty good. And then when the South won't surrender or won't stop fighting, then to say, okay, well, we're going to free your slaves in the areas that are still in rebellion. It does not mean that slavery ends in Tennessee, even though it's not still in rebellion in some places. Tennessee technically does not fall under the Emancipation Proclamation because, number one, slaves are freed in areas still in rebellion. It's not. It has already been captured. It's not one of those places that Lincoln describes as an accepted area. So free slaves in areas except for these parishes along the Mississippi River that have already fallen. This section of Virginia that has basically seceded from Virginia and is organizing as the state of West Virginia to come back into the Union as a full state. So those are accepted areas that for one reason or the other are no longer fighting against the Confederacy. Well, what about Tennessee? And if you read the document very carefully, Tennessee is not listed. So slavery continues or can continue in parts of Tennessee, right? But Memphis is different. So you've got this fort established, and you have all of these African-American men who are now in the fort, who will be organized or can be drafted or volunteered into the Union Army. Their labor can be drafted to build fortifications. And you begin to see missionary teachers coming either with societies like the American Missionary Association or some employed by the Freedmen's Bureau. They come to educate the people in the camps, men definitely, and sometimes the women and children who are there as well. So that's kind of the origins or the beginnings of the first school systems or schools specifically for African Americans in Memphis. They would be in those camps. And the first teachers are those missionary teachers or Freedmen's Bureau teachers. So that's the beginnings of it. In terms of the camps themselves, African Americans are in the camps, but they're not, those camps are not supposed to be permanent. So you start to see people who move out of the camps to set up housing in parts of Memphis or downtown areas of Memphis specifically. And in those areas, you start to see the beginnings of schools or schoolrooms, sometimes organized as independent schools operated by a church, the AME Church, or eventually the CME Church, the Baptist Church. Sometimes schoolrooms are rented by free Black people, space, to the Freedmen's Bureau, and then you have teachers employed. You are more likely to have Black people, Black teachers, working in those independent schools set up by Black churches in some cases, or in schoolrooms that have been rented to the Freedmen's Bureau by free Black people. A good example of this is a woman by the name of Celia Burton Burris, who was actually an antebellum free Black resident of Memphis. Her family, free Black family, had been in Memphis since probably the mid to late 1840s. And they had been here, had acquired property. Whether you say well-to-do or not, it's kind of tricky, but they were part of that small free Black population in Memphis. So Celia Burton Burris rents a room to the Freedmen's Bureau, and she is listed as a school teacher. Okay. I want to just kind of maybe back up just a little bit and talk about these early schools that were set up. And just to say, the schools were set up in the refugee, in the military camps, and that the teachers were coming from missionary organizations. They maybe were coming from the Freedmen's Bureau. They were also employed by Black churches. They might be employed by maybe renting a room, like with Celia Burton Burris, renting a room to a teacher or to operate as a school run by the Freedmen's Bureau. So you have all of those different kinds of facilities that might emerge. In the independent schools and in the churches, schoolrooms that are rented, you are more likely to have a variety of African Americans teaching in those schools. In the schools that are operated by the missionary societies, you are more likely to have white women and white men teaching as their missionary responsibility, teaching Black men, women, and children. And I think the important thing to look at, whether you're looking at what's going on in Memphis or what's going on in places like Holly Springs or Corinth, Mississippi, or even further in Nashville, if you look at why Black people are going to these schools and why the teachers, Black teachers, are employed there. They saw it as education, number one, for the student, man, woman, and child, was a way that you could uplift yourself. It was, they had seen the value of education as far as people in the white community, their owners, or just people they're associated with. They could see that the way in which you were able to move yourself along economically or socially was that you needed an education. Yeah. So they saw it as something that was essential. In terms of moving yourself along economically, if you were an African American man, head of household or whatever, or in an African American family, if you were still in a rural area outside of Memphis and other parts of the rural South, you also saw education as a way in which you could protect your children, particularly your daughters. So it's kind of one of the comparative things that you can look at in education in the 19th century, late 19th century. If you look at white families, white immigrant families, and compare them to Black families, working families, once you have this system of, once Blacks are able to become involved in the free labor systems, where you work, you get the benefit of your labor, not just free in terms of non-slave, but free in terms of the laborer is able to earn money and then to reap the benefits of that labor. That's different from enslaved. So once you're able to do this, if you are a free Black family and you have several children, who's going to be the person, the child, that you pull out of, in agricultural labor, you pull out of the fields and allow to go for an education? And if you're an immigrant family, who's going to be the child that you allow to attend school instead of sending them out to get a job? For immigrant families, it's more than likely going to be a son. For free Black families, period, it's more than likely going to be a daughter. Now, why the difference? The free Black, or the Black family is thinking, if I'm working in an agricultural setting, more than likely the person who is maybe overseeing the labor in that agricultural setting is going to be a white man. And thinking back to slavery, that meant that you subjected your female child to the possibility of sexual abuse. So that's the labor you pull out of the field. And that's the person that you send to school. On the other hand, if you're an immigrant family and you have like 2 sons and 3 daughters, you try to send one of those sons because you're thinking, okay, once he gets his education, then he can help support the family. And when he supports the family, we can educate another son. Then maybe we'll educate the daughters, but they're going to get married anyway, so we don't need to do that. Not necessarily, but it's a pattern that I think if we look at early education, and this is a period in the late 19th century or in the 19th century when you do have major waves of immigration that are coming in, and as they're coming in, it's interesting to look at what's going on in the schools, this educational process. But in any event, if you look at the schools at this point, you've got a variety of types of schools that are existing. You've got some of the earliest teachers there. I think some of the most interesting, Celia Burton Burris, who operates her own schoolroom. You've got, in terms of an independent school, you have a Union soldier, T.H. Place, who is a teacher in one of these camps. You have in an independent school a Reverend Thomas N. Stewart, who is operating an independent school, and the teachers include Stewart, his daughter, and another young Black woman. So those are early teachers. But on the other hand, if you look at the missionary schools, you've got women like Fanny Kiddo, white women like Fanny Kiddo and Lucinda Humphreys, and a whole cadre of white women who have come down with the missionary societies. Some of them, have done this in other parts of the South. And the missionary societies encouraged white women to go into these educational facilities for Black children in these Southern settings. They encouraged the white women because they saw them as the model of womanhood, of the ideal woman, the educated woman, that could then become, it could be replicated among Black women. You could promote the idea of, the ideal woman's sexual purity, piety, domesticity, all of that could be replicated and promoted. So you've got white missionaries, you've got educated Black people who are also doing this. Then increasingly, during the Reconstruction period, you also have some Southern white women who need a job to support their families. So they are also going in as teachers in some of the Black schools. For the most part, until you get into the 1880s and 1890s, the majority of teachers in the Black schools are going to be white missionary teachers as these schools are developing. But then over a period of time, what you're also going to see is that they are, in a sense, creating a cadre of teachers that will eventually replace them. They're kind of like creating their replacements. Now, I don't know whether they really intended for this to happen, but that second generation of teachers in the Black schools that are developing in Memphis will be Black teachers. It's kind of gradually emerging. Now, it's not, being a missionary teacher in Memphis was, especially in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, it was not easy. And you've got, in 1865, creating these schools, in 1866, you had the Memphis Massacre. And all of the schools for African Americans, that school rooms and school buildings, or school sites that had been developed from 1863 to 1866, so in that kind of like 2.5, 3 year period, all of these schools were destroyed by the mobs during the Memphis Massacre. And of course, I guess the best way to describe what's going on in the massacre without having to go through all this detail on it is that you had a reaction among white Memphis population to a large number of African American men, soldiers, who were coming through Memphis and Fort Pickering as they were being mustered out of the Union Army, stacking their weapons, getting their last pay, whatever, and then moving on, or in some cases staying in Memphis, to a large, increasingly large, free Black population in Memphis. Before the Civil War, you had Black Memphians, or Blacks in Memphis, were approximately 17% of the population, or maybe 4,000. By the end of the Civil War, Blacks are maybe closer to 40% of the population, because you've had so many people come in, because it's a sanctuary city. And by 1865, 1866, there is this question of, where are we going to put Black people? Where are they going to go? They're still poor for the most part. So you've got this conflict emerging, economic and social conflict that's emerging. And it just takes one spark, a small conflict between Black soldiers and Memphis police, white police force at this point, and it erupts into 3 days of violence, where white mobs attack African Americans in that small area of South Memphis or in downtown Memphis. And in the course of that, every school is destroyed, every church, black church that had been established is destroyed, houses are burned, and these are more like shanties that are burned. About 44 people are killed, only 2 of whom are white, and they're kind of like victims of friendly fire. All of the teachers in these schools, white teachers in the schools, are run out of town. But what is also interesting, they come back very quickly. So what you see is 3 days of violence, but within a year, these schools have come back. The teachers have come back. You have, if anything, a larger school population. And that again says that African Americans value education. They knew the importance of it. There are different, again, levels of education that are going on. There is the skills education that is continuing. There's people who are indentured in a sense to learn skills like dressmaking and hairdressing and cooking. Not cooking so much, that's more of a kind of a private kind of indenture or something. Barbering, carpentry, those things, those skills are being passed along because those are ways that people can earn a living. But the regular school systems are teaching reading, writing, simple math, and then moving students through this whole process, beginning education, finishing early elementary education, preparing them possibly for advanced education, maybe in Nashville at Fisk. You don't quite have college education at this point, but it is coming. So you're kind of emerging. The school system is emerging, it's developing.
Thank you. I was gonna say, I think, some of the teachers you brought up, like Burris and a number of other ones, you talked about them. I also am familiar with Ida B. Wells and Julia Bond and Virginia Broughton teaching during this time period. Do you have any insight on like how they approach education and what were their experiences as Black women? What were their gendered, unracialized experiences teaching in this new school system?
I think it tends to vary, and it develops over time. They saw themselves coming in as having this mission. They saw themselves, they were very small groups. They started out there maybe like probably the longest serving Black woman teacher, and this is a woman who starts in like the 1863, 64 period, and she teaches until 1878, and she dies during the yellow fever epidemic in 1878, was a woman by the name of Brafteal Moody. She starts out as a single woman. She eventually marries a Black Memphian, Alex Moody. She continues to teach. I don't know whether, I don't have information as to whether she has children during this period. But, you can kind of see her commitment to education in that way, that it's just something that she just does. Maria Robinson Rankin, she comes from Ohio. That's another little core of African Americans who come in. You've got, I always like to call them the Ohio people, because H.N. Rankin comes from Ohio. Maria Robinson comes from Ohio. And I kind of think she came here because she marries a man who may have been an escaped slave, Alex Robinson, who ends up in Ohio, Columbus, in a part of Columbus, Ohio, who stays there until the Union Army begins recruiting Black men as soldiers. Then he comes back to this area, possibly because his daughter is here. His daughter Nettie, by an enslaved woman, probably is still here. He is still in the Union Army, and they don't really record him as having any military service, but simply that he goes to Memphis as an artist or somebody. I don't really know what he's doing. And then he's back in Ohio.
Yeah.
And with Nettie, he brings his daughter back, and then eventually marries Maria Bass, a free black woman who's from a property-owning family in Ohio. And at the end of the Civil War, they come to Memphis. She's educated, and she gets a teaching job, and he continues as unskilled labor, but as what we would call a hotel porter.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he dies in a kind of freakish accident where part of his job was to go down to the river boats and escort, try to convince people that they should get a room at his hotel or at the hotel where he was working. And you got to be the first person on the riverboat. So I think he just overlooked the dangers there, and he jumps from the wharf to the deck of the boat, and he misses it, hits himself in the chest and falls in the river, and he drowns. She goes back, she finishes the school term, and then she goes back to Ohio, to her home in Ohio, because her mother and sister are still there. But then she comes back, and she gets a job working in this independent school that's now operated by H.N. Rankin, who had come in and was a teacher in the military camp, and then kind of goes out into the city and has a lot of different occupations. A lawyer at one point, then he's a minister at another point, and a teacher. So he's got all these things that he's doing. So she eventually marries him, and she still has her stepdaughter Nettie with her, and the marriage doesn't go well, but that's a whole nother soap opera thing. So the two of them are teachers. You've got several other people, just to kind of name a few of them. You've got Mattie Clouston, who is the daughter-in-law of a very wealthy, prosperous, free black family. She marries the son into the family. Don't know what her, given her maiden name was, but she marries a man, Eugene Clouston, and she teaches in the schools, these early schools, for about a year or two, and then either they move to a different place or she, goes wherever. Ida B. Wells was a teacher in the schools. Now, she's not here until probably about the 1880s, because she's from Mississippi, Holly Springs, Mississippi. And she is in Holly Springs until after the 1878 yellow fever epidemic, because her father, her parents, and a younger sibling, they die in the epidemic, and she's the sole support at that point of her other siblings. So rather than see her other siblings divided up and kind of farmed out to other relatives, she decides that she's been educated in missionary schools in Holly Springs, and she continues her education to the point where she's able to teach in the schools. So she is one of the earliest in the 1880s of this kind of cadre of black teachers. And by 1875, you've started to see this transition from an almost all white teaching force to a black teaching force in the black schools. And what started out as mostly missionary schools have now been folded into the Memphis school system as the black schools, because Tennessee law, state law, said very simply, blacks can be educated, but black and white students will have to be educated in separate facilities. They cannot be educated in the same facilities. So rather than undergo this process of setting up and establishing a completely new black school system, what Memphis does is to fold the missionary schools into the Memphis school system, and they become the schools for black students. But what they also do at that point, when they incorporate these schools, they incorporate this mostly white teaching force. And that works for a while.
Tell me how that goes. What happens with that? Yeah.
Well, what happens is that essentially you start to see pressure for more Black teachers in these schools. And that pressure probably comes in two forms. One is the form, one part of it is that you start to see questioning of what is being taught in these schools. What are these white teachers teaching to these Black students? And the questioning, it doesn't all come from the Black community. Some of it comes from the white Memphis community.
Yeah.
Because it's, what are these missionaries from the North? What are they teaching to Black people in the South? And are they teaching them ideas that might encourage them to, rebel or, to question their place in Southern society? This is 1870s, 1880s. Reconstruction has ended in Memphis long before this. Reconstruction ends, most people, I think a lot of people, and I hope not teachers, think that Reconstruction ends in 1877 everywhere. Reconstruction had already ended in some places, and technically it ends whenever a state is readmitted to the Union. That means that they are now able to gain more control over their institutions and their politics. Well, for Tennessee, that was like 1869.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for the end of Reconstruction in Tennessee, it's not 1877. It was like 8 years before that. So what you start to see is this questioning. What's going on in these schools for Black students? What are they being taught? Can we continue to trust these Northern missionaries to teach Black people the way we think they should be taught? So that's part of the questioning. The other part is a questioning on the part of some Black teachers, questioning the white missionaries who have come to question whether these Black teachers are fully capable to teach. In other words, questioning my ability as a teacher, my capability. And I think one of the best examples of how that works out is a conflict between a missionary administrative person, Barnum, J.T. Barnum, I think is his name, and a very competent Black teacher, Sarah Thompson. And Sarah Thompson and her husband James had come to Memphis in the early 1870s. They had come to Memphis from Ohio. They're another part of the Ohio group. And I think because they are also from Columbus, Ohio, or Cincinnati, but they're from the same place in Ohio that Maria Robinson and Alex Robinson, same town. They come in the same time period, so I'm pretty sure that they knew each other.
Probably so.
And like Maria Robinson Rankin, Sarah Thompson was very well educated. All the records indicate that she had schooling from Oberlin. Now, Oberlin had different programs. Everybody didn't go through this super academic program because there are like a couple of tracks that you could follow. But she was very well educated. She was so well educated that when she first came to Memphis, she was very much in demand as a teacher. They wanted to get her in these schools. And she starts out kind of negotiating, there's a public school system, there are the missionary schools, are the possible public schools that are out there developing, and then these other independent schools operated mainly by Black people, and this question, which one is she going to go in? And she was really able to negotiate a better salary by simply telling them, I'm worth more than that.
Yeah.
So after these schools, the missionary schools are incorporated into the city schools, Barnum becomes kind of like the superintendent for Black schools. He's white missionary, but he becomes the superintendent for Black schools. And he pulls in the white missionary teachers who had been working with him. And, he does this in such a way that he's continually questioning the abilities, capabilities of women like Sarah Thompson. And Sarah Thompson, on the other hand, develops a stronger following among some white Memphians who are very conservative. And what they're recognizing, what they're saying is that, Barnum, he's a missionary. We don't know if we still want him. Sarah Thompson is a brilliant woman. She's a great teacher. She wants to teach. We can trust her. So this whole conflict kind of emerges on several different levels. And as it emerges, because Barnum is an administrator in the school system, Sarah Thompson, I think she very briefly loses her job, but then she is employed again after Barnum is pushed out.
Why did she lose her job?
In the conflict, it kind of boils down into, it's not an all black white thing. So you've got some people within the black community who are still supporting the missionaries like Barnum, and they're saying, okay, they came to educate us when nobody else would, so we're going to still back them. But then you've got other people like Sarah Thompson who are getting the support of very prominent white people in the community who are saying, we need to we need to close out some of this influence of the missionaries. And at the particular time when she's kind of pushed out very briefly, it's at a time when Barnum is still in the position of authority within the school system. Then when he gets squeezed out, then they go back and they hire her back. So you have these little conflicts in many different ways. It never boils down to just a black-white conflict within the schools. There are all of these other things. It's regional. It's who controls the education? Who says what black children are going to be taught?
And who should teach them?
And then by the 1880s, that teaching force, the white missionary teachers have been moved out. They've been kind of, a lot of them do go to teach over at what becomes Lemoyne Institute.
I noticed that about their faculty. One of the things that I found really interesting about your work about Sarah Thompson is her critique on the lack of black women in the teacher force during this time period. What was it like to be a black woman during this time period, and your quest for, autonomy over what you want to teach in your classroom, but also navigating sexism in the workforce?
It's, when you say the quest for autonomy and who's going to teach, and teaching has always, in many, let me back that up. Teaching increasingly was seen as something that was kind of like a different aspect of child rearing.
Socialization.
Right. So if women are increasingly seen as being the caregivers and the molders of children, then you're moving away from that time period, probably in the early 1800s, late 1700s period, and into the 1800s, when teaching was seen more as, it was a male job. Most of the teachers all over, they were men. But then increasingly, it becomes kind of like, it's a caregiving thing. You must educate and mold and develop these children. And who is best working with children, especially young children? Women. And, where you would have encouraged people like Reverend Stewart or H.N. Rankin, where you would have encouraged them to stay in the classroom as teachers, because that was something that men did. Now it's something that more and more women are doing. And sometimes it doesn't. When I said that you could have like white Southern women who have been educated, who might be working in black schools with black children, they would accept these jobs because, okay, it's teaching, I can go into this mothering role that probably my great aunts and my grandmothers would have done the same thing if they had been plantation women, slaveholding women. They would have been educating, but in a different way. So it's something that changes, and what is happening in terms of the labor force of teachers by the end of in the last decades of the 19th century is that in African American schools, the labor force of classroom teachers is becoming more feminized, Black women. The labor force in terms of administrators, it's kind of shifting from there being some Black women who are principals or heads of the schools, to those being positions where Black men, you're going to see more Black men. And in terms of high schools, and those don't develop specifically until probably the late 19th century. And you don't really get high schools, you know this from education, you don't get those until you start to see a movement within the overall labor force and the creation of the increasing development of this idea of childhood as this specific protected period in a person's life. And that children need to be cared for, and childhood needs to be preserved. And one of the things that happens is that you start to get secondary education as something that is pushed. So you start with just this basic primary education, and then you increasingly get, let's keep them as children a little bit longer in secondary school. And then, we'll let them stay in school until they're 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So that's something. So you're not going to you'd get the emergence of the first Black high schools, late 19th century. I didn't put a date down, but the first Black high school in Memphis in that period. But you're steadily moving along a group of young Black children through this school system. And if you think in terms of what are they learning, I think in some of the curriculum things that you look at, reading, writing, math, something of the arts. They have to do these demonstrations. They have these beautiful demonstrations at the end of every school year where they, the school board would come in and some people from the community, and they put on these pageants to kind of show what had been accomplished. And, I think the other thing that you see is that, okay, I haven't talked a lot about the political things, but what you see happening in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the passage of the 13th Amendment, ending slavery, 14th, 15th Amendment, citizenship, 14th Amendment, rights of citizenship, 15th Amendment, the right to vote for men, a period in which you have this reconstruction in a sense that Black people are able to exercise these rights that have come through. One of the things that comes out of the violence of the Memphis massacre is this realization that freedom is not enough, that you have to establish a sense of citizenship and protection of these rights. They'd already started that with an 1866 Civil Rights Act, and then they continue this, the government continues this with the 14th Amendment. Then when you get to, 14th Amendment might provide or allow for voting of African American men in some places, but we need to make sure that that's recognized everywhere. So the 15th Amendment, not women though, but the 15th Amendment. And recent scholarship, one particular book is saying very simply that the Reconstruction period, that Second American Revolution or something, really it continues until the early 20th century when you get the 19th Amendment, that there's all of these changes are happening. So in the midst of this, 14th, 15th Amendment, some level of involvement, social, political, economic involvement of African Americans, then 1880s, you start to see kind of a retrenchment, kind of like a backlash. And that backlash is going to result in Jim Crow segregation, disfranchisement of African American men. So the right to vote that they had gotten constitutionally, by 1895, that's going to be, the Supreme Court is saying, well, no, you can have these different ways of, you can have a poll tax, a literacy test later, a poll tax, or literacy tests, qualification on residency, eventually in the 20th century, a grandfather clause. All of these can happen without violating the constitutional rights guaranteed with the 15th Amendment. Or you can set up separate facilities and require that Black people and white people be separated, but that doesn't violate the 14th Amendment rights. And some of the earliest people who challenged this growing segregation, I think everybody really knows this already, are Black women, teachers. Ida B. Wells. She's traveling on that train where she's always sat in what was considered the first class car because she performed respectability. And what that means is that if you look a certain way, if you are dressed a certain way, if your hair is combed a certain way, it is assumed that you are a respectable woman. And that means that as a respectable woman, you're entitled to sit in this car for respectable people on a train, the first class car. Well, the law changed in Tennessee, and we have respectable white people can sit in this car, but all Black people will have to sit in the car that's reserved for Black people, which is not necessarily, it's not a car only for Black people. It's actually the smoking car, which, a respectable woman does not go in the smoking car of a train at this point, because you didn't just smoke in that car, you chewed tobacco as well. And when men chewed tobacco, you spit, which meant you probably spit at the spittoon 20 feet away to see if you could make it. Tobacco juice, and a respectable woman in her respectable attire is dragging her long skirt. So Ida B. Wells refused to be put in the smoking car. And she literally is dragged off of the train, her clothes torn. Okay, that's an infringement on her personal space as a respectable woman. This happens to other Black women traveling on trains. The cars are increasingly segregated. Ida B. Wells fights it in the local court. She wins in the local court. It is appealed. The railroad company appeals to the state court. She loses in the state court, and it's just publicized all over the newspaper. Darky damsel loses her case. The same thing happens in terms of segregation in facilities, entertainment facilities. In Memphis, there was the Opera House where people went to look at plays and everything, and it had been kind of like on an equal footing. You just buy your ticket, you go and you sit down wherever you want to sit. And then the facility is segregated. So Julia Hooks gets dressed up to go to the theater with friends, and she goes in and she's buys her ticket, goes to sit in the section she had always assumed a seat in, and she's told, no, you can't sit there, you have to sit in the section that we've set aside for Black patrons, and she refuses. She is still a teacher at that point, just like Ida B. Wells was still a teacher when that happened, on the train. And she refuses, and she is arrested, and caused a great deal of uproar. eventually she pays the fine because, okay, she's a respectable woman and she's a teacher. What Ida B. Wells also, and Julia Hooks and other teachers also saw, were these kind of petty acts of discrimination were increasing.
Yeah.
So along with this, what Ida B. Wells sees, and Julia Hooks and other women, other female teachers, is that there is a growing discrepancy between the facilities and the monies and the books and everything that are provided for the black schools and those that are provided for the white schools.
Yeah.
And Ida B. Wells, like,
Writes extensively about
yes,
this. Yes.
she's making a transition at that point from just teaching to journalism to writing, and she writes about this. And Julia Hooks becomes very vocal about this. Ida B. Wells eventually is not rehired. They don't really fire teachers. They just simply don't rehire them the next school year. And they did that quite often to teachers. So you see some black teachers who are here one semester, then they're out for 2 semesters, then they manage to come back to get rehired or something. But Ida B. Wells, not rehired, but she just goes on with her journalism. And she writes and she writes and she protests this growing racism and discrimination into the 1890s, late 1880s and into early 1890s. And she talks about how this discrimination is getting so bad, and maybe I should go and see this new thing called migration to the West, because this is about the period when you have what's called the Exoduster movement, where black people are thinking, well, let's go to these Western areas, the Western territories, get some land, settle there, build up black towns, whatever. So she encourages black people to migrate as this violence and everything and this racism is growing in the city. And then she becomes a strong opponent and spokesperson against lynching, racial violence in the area, particularly after the lynching of her friends. The grocers who were lynched for not initially. Ida B. Wells and many other people, they kind of bought into this idea that black men were being lynched because they posed threats to respectable white women. But then Ida B. Wells, after her friends are lynched, and she begins to look deeper into this whole thing of who is being lynched, then she realizes these lynchings are not taking place because black men are attacking white women. Some of these relationships that are developing between black men and white women are fully consensual relationships. Others, black men are attacked because of economic competition, or black men are attacked because they are demanding their political rights. And those are some of the things that are causing these lynchings. And she writes about it. And she happens to have written a very inflammatory article about lynching while she was out of town, out of Memphis. Mob goes in and burns her building and destroys her presses. And this is at a time when she and 2 other black men had set up a newspaper, the Free Speech and Headlights. And when this happens, the black men, of course, the other publishers, I think they leave town. One of them leaves town, or maybe both. And Ida B. Wells is just advised not to come back. Julia Hooks leaves the school system and sets up her own kindergarten and her own music school. She becomes a social activist or a social welfare activist later, and she becomes kind of like a juvenile court matron or something like that for women, for young black women. And that was very critical because young black women were being arrested and thrown into situations more or less like all male prisons or whatever. So you have these young black women in with all of these men. And there was a push among black women, respectable black women, but also among some white women during this period, to have men and women separated in these prisons. So when Julia Hooks is appointed to that position, it's at a time when she is really able to interact with a growing class of white women who are concerned about those same things. They're not concerned about integrating these facilities. They're concerned about separating them in terms of gender. So it's a very critical period. So I'm saying all that to say that black women teachers become very active in the social arrangements, social situations in the South. Virginia Broden is another one. She has her own little set of protests with the school system. And again, it kind of boils down to questioning whether these black women are as fully capable to teach and administer as not just white women, but now are they on an equal status or an equal plane with black men? Or do we want black men only in these administrative positions? So that's another little conflict. And she ends up eventually leaving the school system and becomes a writer and a missionary. Many of these black women teachers also become very active in the emerging club women's movement, black club women's movement. So you've got Julia Hooks.
Can you talk to me a little bit more about, I guess, the role of these women as respectable in their community, and just how people perceive these women, not in terms of educators, but like just their community role, also the class dynamics that underlie that, and respectability.
I think what you see happening in the late 19th century, there is this idea that's kind of evolved throughout the second half of the 19th century of what we could call the ideal woman. And black women moving from slavery into freedom into the 19th century, they're moving from positions whereas enslaved women, their respectability was never assumed. Because I was listening to something, I think in another book I was listening to on tape or something, and they were talking about what you see happening. If we back up to the Memphis massacre, where another aspect of the violence of this massacre was the rape of at least 5 black women. And when these 5 black women went before these investigating committees and they testified, they told these committees, this is what happened to me. It was a claim of, I am entitled to the same level of respectability as other women are. They assumed that this was happening. Now, the federal government was already moving in that post-Reconstruction period toward staking out a position that said that the assumptions that black women were sexually available to anybody, including their owners, that you basically, the assumption that you could not rape a black woman, especially an enslaved woman, because she had no claim to her body. So you could abuse her owner's property and he would have a claim to you having but the woman, no. Well, the federal government had said to Union military soldiers who, they're soldiers. So in some places where they're moving across the South, they were also involved in the sexual assaults on black women and on these plantations. So the Union Army was saying, no, you can't do that. Well, these black women who stand up and say, no, these men who raped me did not have a right to my body. My body belongs to me. and I am going to stand up and say this. Well, that was something that it's like, wow, this is like a revelation.
Yeah.
And you begin to see, remember I said when black farmers, blacks in agricultural communities, when they can withdraw some of their children or their family from farm labor, agricultural labor, it is the women that they withdraw first. And you begin to see that even in terms of the dress, if you look at old family portraits, I could see this in my own family. If you look at some of the late 19th century portraits of black women in your family, you see that they have these high collars on and these long sleeves, and they are modeling respectability in dress. And then if you look back maybe another generation into sketches or photos of black women on plantations, there's a difference in that dress. So the first women who come in to teach in schools, those white women who come in, they are employed because they model this respectability. And then their students, the female students, they continue to model this. And when black women go into the classrooms, they are very, very concerned about their clothing. Ida B. Wells loved clothing. I mean, she spent probably more money than she could afford to spend on clothing, borrowing money in some cases from Robert Church. But it's because that was important to a woman. You know, she had to dress a certain way because she's very conscious as a black woman teaching young black children, female children, that they are watching the way in which she carries herself. Yeah. So, you know, that was a part of your teaching role. Now, in terms of class, what that says is that you're setting a line between, it's kind of difficult to say middle and upper class because those terms don't always fit in terms of what African American experiences, the lives that they're living at that point. But you're setting a respectability line. Yeah. And you're saying that these women are respectable, and to be respectable and respected, you have to model this behavior. So when I was telling you about the Rankin divorce, H.N. Rankin and Maria Rankin, when they divorced, the whole process of how this is carried out, it's a very public thing. Yeah. And he accuses her and she accuses him, but what do they accuse each other of? Adultery, having sexual relations outside of them. I mean, it's like, now whether any of this was actually happening, you know, who knows? But he knew, first of all, that for him to accuse her of doing it when she was a teacher in the school system, this was really it really could affect her job. Yeah. And she essentially, if I'm remembering the case, all the case notes right, she essentially has even some public school administrators who come forward to back her up and say, no, there's a lot of politics involved here because, you know, these are his people and these are her people. So it was a respectability thing. Celia Burris's niece, Mary Ellen Burton, was a beautiful black woman, mixed race woman. They describe her in the newspapers as just being unbelievably beautiful. But she had a boyfriend. And the boyfriend was actually a young white druggist. And they were together for many, many years. And then the young black men in the community heard about this date she was having with her boyfriend. And oh my goodness, it hit the newspapers about how they literally chased her through the streets because, you know, this was like not respectable. And if I get my dates right, I think that was one of the last times that she is listed as a teacher in the school system because of this public outrage. Now, their relationship between the two, the young druggist and Mary Ellen Burton, continued for several years, and eventually they had like 3 children or something.
Was he the one who bit himself and bit her and drank her blood so that he can have that one drop?
Well, that could have been, but
Okay.
they take a whole different approach to this.
Yeah.
They decide one day that they're going, after 3 children,
Yeah.
that they're going to just cross over the river to
In
Arkansas and,
yeah.
you know, get married.
Mm-hmm.
And they do. And it would have been okay for a while, you know, because they just wanted to legalize the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And she was dressed as a respectable woman, and she married this respectable looking man. But there was a white Memphis guy who happened to be in the same hotel that they were staying in. And he comes back and he reports it, and it gets in the newspaper. And it's just publicized everywhere. It becomes another one of these big scandalous things.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, they go back to talking about, well, you know, she was, had once been identified as this beautiful young black teacher and everything. And then to kind of resolve this, they do something very, very interesting. Now, Tennessee, like many southern states, had passed what's called an anti-miscegenation law. And what they do, essentially, she gets arrested because she's violated the anti-miscegenation law. She gets out of jail. He doesn't get arrested. You know, that doesn't,
Yeah.
but then they develop this case.
Mm-hmm.
And what they say very simply is that you may have thought that she was this beautiful black teacher, but she really wasn't. She was actually, her father was actually this man from Mexico who happened to be married to her aunt, Celia Burton Burris, Andrew Burris, was of Mexican background.
Mm-hmm.
So her father was Mexican. And by the way, her mother, Jane Burton, was actually, how do they put it? Jane and Celia's mother was actually a white woman who had a relationship with a black man. They definitely knew that Jacob Burton, Celia's father, was black, because Ellen Burton, this white woman, had actually gone to the Tennessee legislature back in the 1830s and freed him. That was the way you emancipated a black person, was that you went before the state legislature and emancipated him. So Ellen had done that to Jacob. So they knew that Jacob was black.
Yeah.
And Jacob was the father of Celia and several other children. But there was a younger child, Jane, who was Mary Ellen's mother. And it just, they said, well, you know, Jane wasn't really Jacob's daughter. Jane was actually a child that Ellen had with this prominent white dentist in Dyer County. So if Jane's father was Mexican and her mother was actually, let me see, how did they put that? Her mother was the daughter of this prominent white dentist, and Jane's mother, Ellen Burton, she wasn't white. She was actually a Native American. So they had it all kind of, and in just probably like 2 weeks, Mary Ellen Burton had transitioned from being this beautiful African American school teacher in the Memphis schools to being this, we just happened to have discovered that she's actually white. So she did not commit miscegenation because she was a white woman who married a white man.
Now she's, because she's not black. She's
not black.
white.
She's white. She crossed that color line just like that. But it was just such an interesting thing to do. And they remained in Memphis as a married couple for probably a few more years. And then Mary Ellen and the 3 children that they had, they eventually moved to Brooklyn. And the druggist, he stayed here. No, I'm sorry. The druggist and the children stayed here for a few more years. Children were educated, white schools, all of this. And Mary Ellen, the mother, she moved to Brooklyn, set up a house there. And then eventually the druggist moved to Brooklyn. And it's an amazing thing to be able to trace them to Brooklyn, because they lived there as a married couple. He died. His will was filed in the New York courts. Then a few years later, she dies. Her will is filed in the New York courts. Celia's will is filed in the Memphis courts. And when it is, she continued to list Mary Ellen as her niece, and in fact to leave all of her property to Mary Ellen, and to leave Mary Ellen's husband, the druggist, as the executor of her estate. So it was all these weird things that are happening that place these Black women teachers in the context of what is happening in Tennessee and Memphis in terms of this racism and in terms of segregation, miscegenation, streetcar laws, segregation, all of this. But these teachers, again, they are seen as being these models of respectability. So was always a part of a role of teachers. Into the 20th century, or beginning of the 20th century, they would say that, okay, if you are teaching in the public schools and you're married, that's okay. At one point, it was that you weren't supposed to be married. But if you're married, that's okay. But when you become pregnant, you can't teach and be pregnant.
What's his name? He's the first Black millionaire. I don't know.
Robert Church.
His wife.
Anna
was it?
Anna Wright.
She taught until she married him, and I think there was like this understanding that once you get married, like you said, you stop teaching, or if you have children, you stop teaching. She was another part of this early cohort of young Black women who were teaching in the schools, who were products of the Memphis schools, products of those first schools that were organized. Here you have Anna Wright, who was a daughter. She was antebellum Memphis, been here before the Civil War, and eventually had been emancipated. Her father was white, and her mother was a Black woman, and eventually the man she was a twin, her mother was, and he sent the twin daughters to Indiana and had them emancipated, but then brought them back, which was kind of unusual, because usually when you could free your slaves, but they would have to stay out of the state. State law would say that, but somehow they come back. So Well, thank you, Dr. Vaughn. Do you have any message or lessons you feel that educators today can learn from this cadre of educators, really, help establish the foundation of our school system?
I think the thing that I would say about this first two generations of Black teachers is that they put down a foundation for each generation after them. And in each of these subsequent generations, you can see still this dedication to teaching. I think I mentioned with the professional development workshop, I'm a product of Memphis school systems, public school systems. I've taught in the Memphis school system, actually just 1 year. And then I've taught in Shelby County school systems, Shelby County is a totally different way of developing schools, because they develop as rural schools, and with the separate rural schools that are dealing with townships, separate townships. So when you're looking at how the schools develop in Germantown and Collierville and Millington and whatever the others, Whitehaven, not so much. Cordova, Lakeland, but not quite Cordova. When you look at those, these are separate towns that are on an equal political level with Memphis. So when you're talking about the Shelby County schools, Memphis is just the largest of the districts in the Shelby County schools that is allowed to operate kind of its separate independent school system, just like these others.
Mm-hmm.
And sometime in the late 1800s, those Shelby County schools, they come together to organize the Shelby County schools.
Yeah.
But they're these independent, these separate school districts, separate townships that run the schools. Now, what you see happening there is the same thing in a sense that you see happening in Memphis, that by the end of the 19th century, you have two school systems, one for blacks, one for whites. In Memphis, you have two school systems, one for blacks, one for whites, developing in Shelby County schools as well. But they're very different programs, because an agricultural school system in the South operates with a different kind of agenda. When school education becomes compulsory in the late 19th century, compulsory in those rural school districts is going to mean a different kind of scheduling, because black students are labor. And so the months that they can go to school and is shorter. And in the Memphis City schools, black students are not so much labor as they are. They may be working, but their labor is not confined to this agricultural schedule. So that becomes different.
Interesting. Also, I'm thinking about the curriculum too.
Curriculum is very different. Well, curriculum is different. What you see happening in the late 19th century and into the 20th century is that in this period in the late 19th century, when you have philanthropy, philanthropic efforts coming in, they generally many of them come in with the idea of improving black education and facilities. So you've got the Jeans Fund, you've got the, what's the name of the schools? The Rosenwald Fund, which is Sears. It's that big, the people who developed the Sears Roebuck and Company. So you got Jeans, you've got Rosenthal, you've got one other one. They come in and they come in with models and ideas for how you can improve segregated schools, black schools. Many of them, for the most part, in rural communities. But it's with the idea that for Rosenwald, for example, we will give you money, but you've got to have community support. So it's more of a matching kind of thing. And that goes a long way in helping to develop black schools in these rural areas. They're less likely to operate in urban areas like Memphis.
There's also this, with this understanding that we'll help you, we'll match your funds, but part of your curriculum has to speak to our industrial needs. So you start to see, very gendered and work-oriented curriculum for the support of these really rural black schools across the South.
And you also see with one of these funds, I think it may be the Jeans Fund or the Southern Education Board or something, an effort to improve the training of black teachers in those schools. So it's those kind of things that are going on. And again, more in the rural areas. And what's really interesting with the Rosenwald schools is that they are building schools. They're helping communities to build schools. But it's kind of almost like a Sears Roebuck plan, because there are architectural plans and all of these schools, they have like the same design. And you could have the 4-room, the 6-room, the room with the format with this, and that's how you can, if you've ever seen any of the photographs of these the Rosenwald schools, they're amazing. But it's the same idea that Rosenwald was using in terms of people being able to order a house from Sears Roebuck. You can just kind of go in there, let me see. I'm out here on the prairie, I want this house shipped kind of almost like a prefab house,
Yeah.
ship it across, and you build a house. So same thing with the schools.
And even to the placement of the windows.
The windows.
Being really strategic to have light during the day.
And air and everything. Oh, it's just, that's something that's just always been fascinating.
Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of people, a lot of schools started out with those Rosenwald models. And unfortunately, there are some that are still in existence, but I think probably when modernization destroys a lot of architecture, old architecture. So, it's
Thank
really
you.
interesting.
Thank you, Dr. Vaughn. I really
so
appreciate it. I can
welcome.
talk to you forever. I really appreciate your time this afternoon, and I just appreciate your contribution to supporting educators and their comprehension and understanding of the rich history of these institutions that they're a part of. And I'm really grateful for you taking time to share that with us.
No problem. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.